Queen Caroline of Ansbach despised her son Frederick, but he never deserved the cruel betrayal she dealt him on her deathbed. As Queen Consort of Britain, Caroline of Ansbach's job was to sit back and be supportive of her king, George II. Smarter than her royal husband, smarter than pretty much everyone actually, Caroline schemed and plotted against her enemies, especially the ones within her own family. Maybe it's no wonder Caroline had so many interpersonal issues. She started out her life in a nightmare family situation. Though she was born in 1683 as the daughter of a German noble clan, none of this privilege saved her from tragedy. Her father perished from smallpox when she was 3, and her mother died when she was 13, turning her into an orphan. Still, that's when destiny came knocking. Alone and vulnerable, Caroline ended up in the court of the King and Queen of Prussia. After all, Queen Sophia of Prussia had been her mother's friend. Sophia quickly took the girl in as her ward, only to discover that Caroline had a rare intellect and curiosity, not to mention that she was also turning into a beautiful woman. This meant there was only one thing to do. Caroline's noble breeding, pleasing face, and sharp smarts made her, as her surrogate mother, Queen Sophia, put it, the most agreeable princess in Germany. So it was no time at all before the Queen of Prussia was plotting to marry Caroline off to the future Holy Roman Emperor. But Caroline's response stunned everyone. Marrying the suitor meant changing religions, so Caroline, showing a stubborn side even then, said no. In months, she'd have an even bigger problem to deal with. In 1705, Caroline went through the third enormous ordeal in her young life. That year, her beloved Queen Sophia passed suddenly from pneumonia at only 36 years old. The news threw Caroline into a depressive stupor, and she wrote to a friend, "The calamity has overwhelmed me with grief and sickness, and it is only the hope that I may soon follow her that consoles me." At once more, fate had a far different plan in store for Caroline. Queen Sophia may have been gone, but that summer the late monarch still managed to give Caroline a gift of a kind. In June, Sophia's nephew, Prince George Augustus of the House of Hanover, visited Caroline's court, but his appearance turned out to be deeply bizarre. Oddly, George came to visit in disguise, and his reasons had nothing to do with practical joking. Prince George was on a serious mission to find a bride like Caroline and make heirs, but his family history in the marriage department was not good. In fact, the House of Hanover was notorious for infighting, and his own father's marriage to Sophia Dorothea of Celle had ended with the patriarch, allegedly, killing his wife's lover and, definitely, locking her up for decades without ever letting her see her children again. As such, George thought it best to do some reconnaissance on Caroline as his potential bride. He just had no idea how it would backfire. Don't get me wrong, George was obsessed with Caroline from the start. He'd heard rumors of her incomparable beauty and mental attributes, but the reality far outstripped even his imagination, and soon he would not think of anyone else after her. The thing was, Caroline, sharp as ever, knew who he was from the start. Lucky for him, though, she also liked what she saw, and she agreed at last to a match with him. That said, she might have had some ulterior motives. Now George's family was firmly in the utterly dysfunctional category, what with the locking up of his mother and him never seeing her again. But they did have one thing going for them. They were virtually next in line for the English throne. Although their distant cousin Queen Anne currently ruled, she was sickly and without children. Soon, the scepter was due to go to George's father, and eventually to George himself. It's hard not to think that cunning Caroline had her eye on the crown when she said yes to George, but she also had absolutely no idea what she was really in for. Before that summer ended, Caroline traveled to George's home court of Hanover and married him in a simple ceremony. That's when the pressure started. Her in-laws wanted a male heir right now, so much so that George's father even forbade him from attending military campaigns until he put a bun in Caroline's oven. And as long as that bun came out as a boy. It was the price of marrying into a soon-to-be royal line, but Caroline found a way to come out on top. She always did. Defying the odds and even the conventions of their time, George and Caroline were deeply in love and had no problem doing their marital duty, which is why Caroline got pregnant almost instantly. In a stroke of luck, she also gave birth to a boy, Frederick, in January of 1707. In a different story, the birth of a son without any trouble would have been a good omen for Caroline. Instead, it was a disaster from the very start. Soon after giving birth, Caroline fell deathly ill with smallpox and then pneumonia, and she started fighting for her life. While the palace kept her infant son away from her to prevent him from catching anything, her husband's response was heartbreaking. Devoted to his wife, George stayed by her side to nurse her, even catching smallpox himself. Thankfully, they both survived. But looking back, it was just the beginning of a wild ride with little Prince Frederick. In 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain died, and Caroline's father-in-law became King George I of England, while she and her husband became the Prince and Princess of Wales. Accordingly, Caroline traveled over to England, the only sea voyage she ever took, to pick up her titles in person and settle into royal life. But she forgot one thing back home. When Caroline and George went over to England to sit at King George I's feet, they brought most of their daughters with them, but left their 7-year-old Prince Frederick back home for his uncle to raise him. Maybe this seemed like a good idea at the time, but it would be 14 long years before they ever saw him again. Caroline, however, wasn't one to wallow in sentimentality. In fact, she got embroiled in British intrigue almost immediately. When Caroline went over to England and became Princess of Wales, a whole lot else about her life changed. Because there was no current queen consort, I'll remind you again that the King of England still had his ex-wife locked up somewhere in Germany. Caroline was actually now the highest-ranking woman in the realm. That power definitely went to her head. The royal family is supposed to present a united front to their people, but getting a bunch of entitled nobles to get along is no easy task. Caroline started stirring the pot within weeks. While King George I was thoroughly German, Caroline and her husband wanted to anglicize themselves. They quickly engaged themselves in British politics, culture, and friendships. This wasn't exactly a good thing. It might seem innocent and good-hearted for Caroline and George to engage with British culture, but they knew exactly what they were doing. They now looked completely new and modern next to the fusty old king, and their popularity soared, just like Caroline had probably intended all along. After all, she was going to be the next Queen of England. Before long, they had established a fully-fledged rival court in opposition to the monarch, which King George was very unhappy about. That old House of Hanover dysfunction was popping up again, and tensions rose to a fever pitch. When that fever broke, it was tragic. In the midst of these political machinations, Caroline fell pregnant again, but this time it didn't go her way at all. After 5 healthy pregnancies, she now gave birth to a stillborn son. People close to her blamed the tragedy on the idiocy of English doctors, but the bitterness brewing in the royal court must not have helped matters. Caroline was likely devastated, but it was going from uneasy to nightmarish overnight. In 1717, a year after her stillbirth, Caroline gave birth to another healthy boy, Prince George William. Ecstatic at her successful pregnancy, Caroline happily prepared for the boy's baptism. Yet here, she made a rare miscalculation. She hadn't taken into account that the royal court was a tinderbox as dry as a desert, and it was about to explode right in her face. On the day of George William's baptism, King George I, who had probably been waiting for his chance snapback, suddenly to take issue with his son and daughter's-in-law marriage choice of godparents. His response was, revenge was unspeakably brutal. Instead of talking the issue up with them, the king placed Caroline and her husband under house arrest at St. James's Palace, then exiled them from court entirely. Unfortunately for Caroline, his wrath did not stop there. In the aftermath of baptism, King George III forcibly separated Caroline and her husband from their children, including the newborn, insisting the babies stay with him while the couple sat in exile. It was a vicious punishment meant to show the upstart Prince and Princess of Wales who actually held the scepter and the power in Britain. But this time, the king had gone too far. During this separation, Caroline went literally sick with worry over her children, and drove herself into such a frenzy that she even snuck into the king's palace to visit them in secret. Eventually, King George III couldn't help but notice and feel guilty for the stress he was causing, and he allowed her free access to her babies. Except by then, it was too little, too late. In February of 1718, Caroline's worst nightmare surfaced, where her youngest boy, Prince George William, fell ill and died when he was just a handful of months old. The palace even had an autopsy to make sure the separation from his mother wasn't what killed him. It turned out he had a polyp on his heart. But whatever the cause of death, the boy's passing didn't help King George III's popularity, nor did it go any way to repairing his relationship with his son and Caroline. Unfortunately, the hits kept coming. Caroline's nerves were obviously frayed down to the core by now, because the very year her infant passed, she miscarried another child, and all it took was being startled by a storm while she was at home. The Princess of Wales buried her third child, and although she would go on to have 3 more healthy children, she never forgot that King George III was the co-author of her misfortunes. So, what was a smart, driven woman to do? Come up with a ruthless plot, of course, one that would fail miserably. Caroline was too smart to simply declare open hostilities between herself and her father-in-law. Instead, she befriended the politician Robert Walpole so that she could have some real power behind the scenes in the government. For a little while, it worked. Walpole even had her and her husband stage a just-for-show public reconciliation with the crown to get more influence, and Caroline hoped get her children back from the king. This did not unfold the way she wanted. Caroline was used to impeccably running the show in her household, but her alliance with Walpole taught her a harsh lesson about her fallibility. Walpole was actually using her to get his own power back, and while Caroline's custody negotiations went nowhere, Walpole became the de facto Prime Minister of Britain. Empty-handed and frustrated, Caroline had to find another way to seek vengeance. In the end, it came in the most natural way possible. In 1727, Caroline got violent news that likely overjoyed her. King George I had been traveling when he suffered a stroke on the road. Although he lingered for another day or so, the King of England and thorn in Caroline's side passed on June 11, 1727. At long last, she was now Queen Consort, and her husband was King George II of Great Britain. One of her first acts was to unite her family at last, but this was the opening of a Pandora's box she would never close. Caroline now had possession of the children King George I had kept from her, but she still had to call over her son, Prince Frederick, from where he had been languishing back in Germany for a decade and a half. Now a grown man, Frederick joined the family in England as the new Prince of Wales in 1728. Only, this was no happy reunion. When Caroline saw her son again, the troubles began. In the years since Caroline had seen her son, Prince Frederick had undergone a troubling transformation. He was now a drinking, gambling rake who kept several mistresses, but that wasn't the worst part. Frederick also had quite the chip on his shoulder for his absentee parents, and in a case of karma for Caroline's own activities as the Princess of Wales, quickly surrounded himself with her political enemies. If only it had stopped there. Throughout the years, Caroline's political acumen had remained sharp as ever. She even encouraged her husband to keep their old frenemy Robert Walpole in power because she knew how influential he was and wanted to stay on his good side. Starting in 1728, this kind of political genius paid her back tenfold. When King George II was abroad, it was Caroline who acted as regent, not the black sheep Frederick. That's right, only Caroline of Ansbach could find a way to cement her influence and insult her son at the same time. Then it all went so wrong. In 1736, one of the king and queen's detractors posted a satirical note to the gate of the royal palace that snarkily read, "Lost or strayed out of this house, a man who has left a wife and 6 children." It was one of the first rumblings against Caroline's influence on George, but the situation was about to turn into an earthquake. When King George II did try to return to his post in England a few months later, a spate of bad luck nearly destroyed everything. First, his ship ran into a storm, which sent rumors spinning around London that the king was dead. When he finally made it back, it went from bad to worse, as he collapsed into his bed with a fever. Caroline must have been sick with worry from end to end, but her son Frederick only saw it as a vicious opportunity. While Frederick had inherited his mother's distaste for the older generation, he'd gotten none of her political cunning, and everything he did was big, loud, and brash. Case in point, Frederick quickly spread another rumor around town that now the king really was dead, forcing George II to clamber out of his four-poster in a feverish haze just to prove that no, he really wasn't. At this point, Caroline and George knew they had to do something about their idiot son. Their solution, however, was a disastrous one. Perhaps hoping that married life would settle her son down, Caroline had married Frederick off to the 16-year-old princess, Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, just before the whole shipwreck debacle. Well, it did not settle him down. It just gave him a new pawn to move around in his attempts to insult his parents any way he could. At one point, he instructed the naive Augusta to always arrive to chapel after Queen Caroline. That way, when she got in, Augusta would have to rudely nudge the consort out of the way to get to her spot. It was a petty annoyance Frederick took immense joy in. But his next move was when this feud became truly ridiculous. When Frederick's new bride got pregnant, he found another way to get revenge on his mother and father. As soon as he found out Augusta was in labor, he launched a brutal plot. He forced the poor princess to travel in the middle of the night to an out-of-the-way palace and give birth to a baby daughter on a tablecloth, no less, since said palace wasn't ready to receive her. Why do this? It was so his parents wouldn't be present for the birth of their grandchild. When Caroline found out, her reply was merciless. Caroline was no rookie to the "I hate my family" game, and although she was horrified at Frederick's actions, she managed to get in her own cutting insult. See, royal births usually had a bunch of witnesses, mostly because people wanted to make sure the child, especially if it was a boy, was legitimate, not some kind of changeling. So when Caroline discovered it was a baby girl, she sniffed with relief that it was a poor, ugly little she-mouse instead of a large, fat, healthy boy. But she didn't stop at mere words. Trying to cut your royal parents out of the line of succession isn't recommended, and Caroline and George II made sure their son paid dearly for his sins. They banished him from their court, as the old king had done to them, and parents and son were now officially estranged from each other. Yet somehow, even after all that, it managed to get more awkward. Caroline's hatred for her son was deep, and she didn't mince her words about it. She reportedly once said, "I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell." Motherhood, at least with a son like Frederick, clearly didn't agree with Caroline. It would also be her downfall. Way back in 1724, when Caroline gave birth to her final child, she'd suffered a serious umbilical hernia. More than a decade later, it came back to haunt her in the worst way imaginable. After a formal reception in the winter of 1737, Caroline was in utter agony and took to her bed. Disgustingly enough, part of her intestine had come through that old hernia opening, and the situation was now threatening her life. Eventually, Queen Caroline realized the end was near, so she enacted one of the final revenges of her life. During this time, Frederick had been trying to see his dying mother one last time. Her response was ice cold. Under his wife's direction, King George II forbade Frederick from seeing Caroline. And though the Queen Consort did relent and send a message later that indicated her forgiveness, that note was probably a tad passive-aggressive. Caroline's last moments on earth were tragically painful. Her strangulated bowel burst on November 17, 1737, and she writhed for 4 more days before passing on the 20th, at the age of 54. There was, however, a dying triumph. When attendants buried her in Westminster Abbey, she made sure her son Frederick wasn't invited to the funeral. In the end, all of Caroline's feuding with her son Prince Frederick came to naught. Not only was she dust in the wind now, but Frederick never even lived long enough to be King of England. In 1751, at the age of 44, he likely suffered a pulmonary embolism and passed suddenly, leaving his son to become George III instead. Caroline's political and emotional influence over King George II, as well as her influence over her family feuds, remains her legacy today, and people were certainly aware of it during her time. One satirical and none too complimentary poem went, "You may strut, dapper George, but 'twill all be in vain. We all know 'tis Queen Caroline, not you, that reigns. Then, if you would have us all fall down and adore you, lock up your fat spouse, as your dad did before you." Personally, though, I wouldn't risk getting on Caroline's bad side like that. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything. End.